The sharp crack of skin against skin silenced the great hall. Lisa stumbled back, her hand flying to her stinging cheek, the metallic taste of blood pooling on her tongue. Before her stood David, her fated mate, the Alpha King, his chest heaving with misplaced rage. Behind him, clutching his arm with feigned terror, was Sienna. "You will never speak to her that way again," David snarled, his eyes flashing a cold, unfamiliar gold. He hadn't just chosen another woman. He had struck his Luna for her. The pack watched in suffocating silence. Lisa didn't cry. She straightened her spine, slowly lowering her hand. "I won't," she whispered, her voice carrying an icy finality that made the ambient temperature drop. "Because I will never speak to either of you again." The silence in the great hall did not break as Lisa turned on her heel. The sound of her boots clicking against the polished marble floor echoed like a gavel striking wood, finalizing a verdict no one had anticipated. She didn't run. She didn't look back. Her posture was rigidly perfect, a stark contrast to the chaotic shattering of her soul. The mate bond, an ethereal thread that had anchored her to David for 5 years, violently twisted in her chest. It felt as though a rusted hook had caught behind her ribs and was being slowly, agonizingly pulled. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat, keeping her chin raised until she passed the heavy oak doors of the royal wing. Once inside their shared chambers, his chambers now, the facade cracked, but only slightly. Lisa moved with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. She bypassed the sprawling walk-in closet filled with silks and jewels bought with the kingdom's wealth. Instead, she knelt beside the heavy oak chest at the foot of the bed. Pulling out a battered leather duffel bag she hadn't used since her days as a border patrol warrior, long before David was crowned king. She packed 3 pairs of dark denim, durable shirts, thermal layers, and a pair of worn combat boots. No jewelry, no dresses. Nothing that bore the crest of the Silver Moon pack. The door clicked open. The scent of rain-washed pine and ozone flooded the room, thick and suffocating. "David." "Lisa, stop being dramatic." His voice was low, laced with the exhausted patience of a parent reprimanding a difficult child. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He didn't look apologetic. He looked annoyed. "You pushed her. Sienna is a fragile omega. She doesn't have your resilience. You forced my hand." Lisa paused, holding a heavy wool sweater. She didn't turn around. The skin of her left cheek throbbed, a hot, spreading fire that felt like a brand. Fragile. Sienna had systematically dismantled Lisa's authority over the past 6 months, whispering poison in David's ear, playing the victim while orchestrating the exile of Lisa's closest allies. "I told her to stop sitting in the Luna's chair during council meetings," Lisa said, her voice eerily calm. "That is not pushing. That is enforcing the ancient laws you swore to uphold." "It's just a chair," David snapped, taking a step into the room. "She likes the view of the gardens from there. Why must you turn everything into a battle of dominance? You're my mate, Lisa. Your position is secure. Why can't you just show a little grace?" Lisa finally turned. The words died in David's throat. Perhaps it was the stark lack of tears in her eyes, or the dark, bruising imprint of his hand already blooming across her pale skin. For a fleeting second, the golden dominance in his eyes flickered, replaced by a ghost of horror at what he had done. But his pride, a beast far larger than his conscience, quickly swallowed it. "Put the bag away," he commanded, using the alpha timbre, a subtle frequency meant to compel submission. Lisa felt the vibration in her bones. But the mate bond, damaged by his physical betrayal, offered a strange insulation. She zipped the duffel bag closed. The metallic sound was deafening in the quiet room. "My position was never secure," Lisa said quietly, slinging the strap over her shoulder. "A Luna is the heart of the pack. You just struck the heart to protect a parasite. You've already made your choice, David. I am simply making mine. You can't leave," he scoffed, though a thread of uncertainty tightened his jaw. "You are bound to me. You won't make it 2 days past the borders before the bond sickness brings you to your knees. You'll come crawling back." Lisa walked toward the door. As she passed him, she didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply looked up, her gaze meeting his with the cold, dead emptiness of a graveyard. "I would rather die coughing up my own blood in the neutral zone than spend another night sharing a bed with a coward." She didn't wait for his response. She stepped out of the room, leaving the Alpha King standing alone in his opulent cage. As she descended the servants' stairwell, avoiding the main hall, she felt the first sharp, breathtaking spasm of the severing bond. She stumbled, catching herself on the stone railing. She gripped the cold stone until her knuckles turned white, breathed through the agonizing pain, and kept walking. The sky wept for her, though Lisa refused to shed a single tear herself. The rain began as a misty drizzle when she cleared the southern gates, transforming into a torrential downpour by the time she reached the dense, ancient pines of the borderlands. 3 hours had passed. The physical toll of walking away from a fated mate was a well-documented agony in werewolf lore, but reading about it in the archives was vastly different from enduring it. It felt like walking through invisible, knee-deep mud while breathing in shattered glass. Every mile she put between herself and David caused the ethereal tether connecting their souls to stretch, fray, and snap at the microscopic level. Her vision blurred, the edges of the forest swimming in the torrential rain. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to drag her down into the earth. She was operating purely on adrenaline and a cold, crystallized fury. She needed to cross the river. The Roaring Fork was the natural boundary separating the Silver Moon Pack from the Obsidian Ridge, the territory of Alpha Kale. Kyle was a legend told to pups to keep them from wandering into the woods. They called him the Shadow Wolf, a brutal, uncompromising warlord who had slaughtered his own uncle to take the throne. The Silver Moon and Obsidian Ridge had been locked in a cold war for a decade. If David's patrols found her here, they would drag her back. If Kale's patrols found her, she didn't know. But at this moment, the unknown monster in the dark was preferable to the monster she knew in the light. Lisa reached the riverbank. The water was swollen and violent, churning with white froth and broken branches. There was no bridge here, only a series of slick, jagged stepping stones that required absolute precision. Another spasm hit her, a vicious tearing sensation right behind her sternum. Lisa dropped to one knee in the mud, gasping as a choked, raw sound finally tore from her throat. Her inner wolf whimpered, confused and terrified by the sudden rejection of their mate. "Get up," Lisa hissed to herself, her voice lost in the roar of the rain and river. "Get up." She forced herself upright, her legs shaking violently. She stepped onto the first wet stone. Her boots slipped, but she caught her balance, her arms windmilling. She jumped to the second, the third. On the fourth, a profound wave of dizziness washed over her. The bond snapped a little further. Black spots danced across her vision. She missed the fifth stone. Lisa plunged into the freezing, turbulent water. The current immediately dragged her under, the cold shocking the air from her lungs. She thrashed, her heavy duffel bag acting as an anchor. She managed to slip the strap off her shoulder, abandoning her few worldly possessions to the river, and kicked frantically toward the opposite shore. Her hands scraped against the sharp rocks. She pulled herself up, dragging her heavy, soaked body onto the muddy embankment of Obsidian Ridge territory. She collapsed onto her back, staring up at the canopy of black pines, her chest heaving as the rain battered her face. She was alive. She had crossed the bloodline. Before she could catch her breath, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the earth beneath her. Lisa froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Emerging from the shadows of the tree line were 4 massive wolves. They didn't bark. They didn't posture. They moved with military precision, fanning out to encircle her. They were terrifyingly large, their coats slick with rain, eyes glowing with lethal intent. The largest of them, a wolf the color of midnight smoke, stepped forward. As it moved, the bones cracked and shifted in a fluid, sickeningly fast transition. Within seconds, a man stood where the beast had been. He was dressed in dark tactical pants and a heavy waterproof jacket. He was taller than David, broader, radiating a quiet, crushing power that made the air heavy. His hair was dark and wet, plastered against a face that was sharp, scarred, and devastatingly harsh. Alpha Kale. He didn't yell. He didn't demand to know her business. He stepped closer, his dark eyes sweeping over her soaked, shivering form, stopping abruptly on the dark, hand-shaped bruise staining her left cheek. The silence stretched, thick with the sound of the pouring rain. Kale crouched down in the mud beside her, his expression unreadable. "You're a long way from the ivory tower, little queen." Kale's voice was a low, rough rasp, like stone grinding against stone. "And you look like you're dying." Lisa met his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to bare her neck. "I'm not dying," she rasped, her teeth chattering. "I'm surviving." A muscle feathered in Kyle's jaw. He stared at the bruise on her face for a second longer, a dark, dangerous storm brewing in his eyes. Then he stood, shrugging off his heavy, dry outer jacket. He dropped it over her shivering shoulders. "Bring her," Kale ordered his men without looking back, turning toward the deep woods. As a guest, not a prisoner, the world returned in fragments. The smell of burning cedar, the muted, rhythmic drumming of rain against heavy glass, the subtle, earthy scent of yarrow, comfrey, and old paper. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of David's palace. Lisa opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling above her was constructed of massive, dark wood beams. She was lying in a large bed draped in heavy furs and thick woolen blankets. Her wet clothes were gone, replaced by an oversized, incredibly soft cotton shirt. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, phantom pain radiated from her chest, the lingering ache of the stretched mate bond. She winced, pressing a hand to her sternum. "Don't push it. Your core temperature dropped dangerously low, and your spirit is fractured." Lisa's head snapped toward the voice. Sitting in a leather armchair near a massive stone fireplace was an older woman with iron-gray hair braided down her back. She was grinding dried herbs in a mortar. "Where am I?" Lisa's voice was hoarse, her throat raw from the river water. "You are in the Obsidian stronghold," the woman said calmly, not looking up from her task. "My name is Ilara. I am the pack healer. Alpha Kale brought you in last night. You've been unconscious for 14 hours. 14 hours. Panic flared briefly in Lisa's chest. Had David realized she was truly gone? Had he sent trackers? As if summoned by her rising anxiety, the heavy wooden door to the room opened with a soft click. Alpha Kale stepped inside. In the dim light of the fireplace, he looked less like a wild beast and more like a weary soldier. He wore simple dark clothes, moving with a silent grace that belied his massive frame. He carried a ceramic mug, the steam rising in lazy curls. He nodded to Alara, who silently gathered her mortar and pestle and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Kale approached the bed, pulling up a heavy wooden stool and sitting down. He held out the mug. "Drink. It's willow bark and honey. It will help with the inflammation." Lisa hesitated, her eyes darting from the mug to his face. She was the Luna of his sworn enemy. He had every reason to drug her, ransom her, or kill her. Yet, his gaze held no malice. It was intensely observant, analytical, but strangely devoid of the predatory arrogance David always projected. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the mug. Their fingers brushed briefly. A sudden, shocking spark of static warmth zipped up her arm, settling deep in her chest. Lisa gasped slightly, pulling her hand back to cradle the warm mug. Kyle's eyes narrowed infinitesimally, but he didn't comment on the spark. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a slow sip. It was bitter, but the heat felt miraculous sliding down her raw throat. "My border patrols found pieces of a leather bag washed up on the riverbank," Kyle stated, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Nothing salvageable. You crossed the roaring fork during a flash flood. That is either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." "It was necessary," Lisa said. Keeping her gaze on the dark liquid in her mug, Kyle leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I know who you are, Lisa. The whole continent knows the Luna of the Silver Moon. What I don't know is why the Alpha King's fated mate nearly drowned herself trying to sneak into my territory in the dead of night, bearing the mark of a man's hand on her face." The bluntness of his words made her flinch. She instinctively reached up, her fingers grazing the tender, swollen skin of her cheek. Did he do this? Kyle's voice dropped an octave, the temperature in the room seeming to chill as his protective instincts, innate to any true alpha, bristled. Lisa could have lied. She could have claimed a training accident, a fall in the woods. But the exhaustion in her bones demanded truth. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Yet it rang loud in the quiet room. "He chose an Omega over me, and when I demanded he respect the pack laws, he struck me to silence me." Silence descended upon the room. It wasn't the suffocating, oppressive silence of David's great hall. It was a heavy, contemplative quiet. Kale stared at the fire, the orange light dancing across the pale scars on his jaw. "And so you left." Kale didn't frame it as a question. He understood. "I left," Lisa confirmed, lifting her chin, finding a fraction of her old strength. "I have nothing. No pack, no title, no clothes, but what I am wearing. If you intend to use me as a hostage to negotiate with David, I must warn you, he won't bargain for me. He believes I will crawl back when the bond sickness becomes too great." Kyle slowly turned his head to look at her. The intensity in his dark eyes pinned her in place. "I do not take hostages, Lisa, and I do not bargain with cowards who strike their mates," Kyle said softly. He stood up, towering over the bed. Yet Lisa felt not an ounce of fear. "You are not a prisoner here. You are under my roof and under my protection. Rest. Let the bond sever. You are safe in the shadows." As he walked toward the door, Lisa felt something shift within her. The agonizing pull from the east, where David was, still burned. But here, in this room, grounded by the quiet strength of the shadow wolf, she felt the first tiny ember of something entirely new. The bond sickness did not arrive like a thief in the night. It crashed over Lisa like a tidal wave of shattered glass. By the evening of her second day at the Obsidian stronghold, the dull ache in her chest mutated into a violent, tearing agony. It was the physical manifestation of a soul being ripped in half. She lay thrashing in the heavy fur-lined bed, soaked in a cold, sour sweat. Her internal temperature plummeted, then spiked, her wolf howling in the dark recesses of her mind, disoriented by the sudden, terrifying void where David's presence used to reside. "Hold her down." Alara's voice cut through the hazy red mist of Lisa's delirium. "If she thrashes, she'll tear a muscle. The fever is boiling her from the inside out." Firm, calloused hands pinned Lisa's shoulders to the mattress. They were too large to be the healer's. Through the blurred, feverish lens of her vision, Lisa saw the sharp, scarred jawline of Alpha Kale. He wasn't using his alpha command to force her submission. He was simply using his physical strength to anchor her to the earth, while her spirit threatened to tear itself apart. "Breathe, Lisa." Kale's rough baritone vibrated right through her skin, a low, steady thrum that rivaled the chaotic storm in her veins. "The tether is snapping. Let it go. Stop fighting the break." "It burns," she choked out, her back arching as a phantom blade twisted between her ribs. She blindly reached out, her fingers digging desperately into Kale's forearm. She expected him to pull away. David hated the display of weakness, hated when she clung to him. Instead, Kale shifted his weight, sitting on the edge of the bed. He uncurled her white-knuckled grip from his arm and took her hand in both of his. "I know," Kale murmured, his dark eyes fixed intensely on her pale face. "A severing is worse than a physical death. But you will survive this. You are stronger than the man who broke it." As he held her hands, that strange, static spark she had felt the night before returned. It wasn't the suffocating, demanding pull of the fated mate bond she shared with David. It was something different, a subtle, grounding warmth, like placing a hand on a sun-baked stone after a long winter. It seeped into her skin, momentarily soothing the frantic, terrified pacing of her inner wolf. Lisa gasped, her eyes fluttering shut as the pain receded just a fraction, enough for exhaustion to pull her under into a deep, dreamless sleep. Kale did not let go of her hand until her breathing leveled out. Hours later, 50 miles to the east, in the opulent royal wing of the Silver Moon Pack, Alpha King David was pacing. "It's been 3 days," David snapped, kicking a velvet ottoman across the room. It shattered a crystal vase against the wall. She shouldn't be able to stay away this long. The bond sickness should have driven her mad by now. She should be crawling back to the gates. Sienna lounged on the edge of the massive 4-poster bed, wearing one of Lisa's discarded silk robes. She carefully filed a manicured nail, feigning a sympathetic sigh. "Perhaps she found somewhere to hide, David. You know how stubborn she is. She's just trying to embarrass you. Making a spectacle to prove a point." David stopped pacing, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ground together. He stalked over to the window, staring out at the torrential rain that had yet to cease. "She has no money. No allies I haven't already banished to the outer territories," David muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He touched his own chest, right over his heart. A dull, annoying ache pulsed there, but nothing debilitating. He was the Alpha King. His ego and power shielded him from the worst of the severing. while the Luna bore the brunt of the emotional trauma. "Send Thorn to the border," David commanded, his eyes narrowing as he stared toward the western tree line. If she crossed the roaring fork, the shadow dwellers might have found her body. Or worse, Kale might have her. I will not have that feral bastard holding my property as a bargaining chip. Sienna paused her filing, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing her delicate features. "Property? David, let her go. You don't need her. You have me." David turned to look at the beautiful, fragile Omega on the bed. She was everything a traditional king was told to want. Submissive, adoring, completely dependent. But as he looked at her, a strange, hollow feeling echoed in the room. "She is the Luna," David said coldly, the gold flashing dangerously in his eyes, silencing Sienna instantly. "And no one walks away from the king." By the 5th day, the fever broke. Lisa awoke to a quiet, empty room, the oppressive weight in her chest replaced by a vast, hollow numbness. The bond was gone. The tether to David had finally snapped. For 5 years she had felt his ambient emotions, his pride, his irritation, his fleeting moments of satisfaction. Now there was only a profound, echoing silence. She sat up slowly. Her muscles trembled with severe atrophy, but her mind was startlingly clear. For the first time in months, she wasn't constantly analyzing David's moods or running interference for Sienna's subtle manipulations. She found fresh clothes folded at the foot of her bed. Dark, tactical canvas pants, a heavy slate gray Henley, and sturdy boots. Practical, protective. It was a stark departure from the suffocating pastel dresses David preferred her to wear for public appearances. Lisa dressed herself, relying on the walls for support as she navigated out of the healer's wing. The Obsidian stronghold was a massive fortress, carved directly into the side of a granite mountain. There were no sweeping marble staircases or gilded chandeliers. The halls were lit by iron sconces, the air smelling of wood smoke, sharpened steel, and old pine. It was a place built for war, not for show. She followed the low murmur of voices echoing down a wide, stone corridor. It led to a heavy oak door left slightly ajar. Inside, a massive topographical map was spread across a brutalist slate table. Kale stood at the head, surrounded by 6 large, heavily scarred warriors. The atmosphere was tense, thick with the scent of impending violence. David has moved 2 battalions to the eastern banks of the roaring fork. A broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his nose was saying. He pointed a combat knife at the map. "He's claiming we kidnapped his Luna. He's demanding her immediate return, or he considers it an act of war." Kale leaned over the table, resting his knuckles on the slate. "Let him consider it what he wants. We do not yield refugees, Marcus, let alone women fleeing abuse." "With respect, Alpha," Marcus countered, his tone deferential but firm. "It's the Silver Moon's elite guard. If they push across the shallows at the Weeping Willow Bend, they'll flank our southern outpost before we can reinforce it. They won't cross at the Weeping Willow Bend." The room went dead silent. 7 pairs of highly lethal, predatory eyes snapped toward the doorway. Lisa stood there, her hand resting on the stone doorframe. She was pale, hollow-cheeked, and looked as though a strong gust of wind could knock her over. Yet, as she stepped fully into the room, she carried the unmistakable, unyielding aura of a seasoned commander. Marcus stepped forward, a growl building in his chest at the intrusion. But Kale raised a single, commanding hand. The growl died instantly. Kale looked at Lisa, his dark eyes unreadable, but a flicker of deep, Genuine curiosity danced in the obsidian depths. "You should be in bed." "I've spent enough time in bed while other people decide my fate," Lisa replied, her voice raspy but steady. She walked slowly toward the table. The warriors instinctively parted for her, unsettled by the cold, tactical deadliness in her eyes. She stopped beside Kale, looking down at the map. It felt strange to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Shadow Wolf. Yet it felt infinitely more natural than standing behind David's throne. "You think they won't cross at the shallows?" Kyle asked, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't patronizing her. He was genuinely asking. David would have backhanded her for speaking out of turn in a military council. Lisa pushed the phantom sting from her memory. "David's lead commander is General Vance," Lisa stated, tracing a finger along the blue line of the river. "Vance is deeply traditional and fiercely arrogant. The Weeping Willow Bend is heavily muddy this time of year. Vance won't drag his elite guard through a swamp because it ruins the psychological intimidation of their pristine white armor. He relies on shock and awe." She tapped a narrow gorge 3 miles north of the bend. "He will cross at the Jagged Narrows," Lisa said with absolute certainty. "It's a harder crossing, but the terrain is rocky and solid. It allows his battalions to march in perfect formation right up to your tree line. It looks better. And David always prioritizes how things look." The warriors stared at her in stunned silence. Marcus looked at the map, then up at Kale, a grudging respect dawning in his eyes. "It's a bottleneck," Marcus murmured, the tactical possibilities turning in his head. "If they cross at the Narrows, they have to march single file for a quarter mile." "Exactly," Lisa said, looking up to meet Kale's gaze. "You don't need to reinforce the southern outpost. You just need 3 archer units positioned on the ridges above the Narrows. You can pin his entire elite guard down without drawing a single blade." Kyle stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Slowly, a dark, devastatingly handsome smirk touched the corner of Kyle's mouth. "Pull the men from the south," Kyle ordered Marcus, his eyes never leaving Lisa's. "Set the archers at the Narrows. And Marcus?" "Yes, Alpha?" "Bring a chair for our guest. She's staying for the rest of the meeting." The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air biting and sharp with the scent of wet granite. The courtyard of the Obsidian stronghold was a sprawling expanse of packed earth, surrounded by imposing, spiked iron gates. Lisa stood on the elevated stone dais of the stronghold's entrance. To her left stood Kale, a silent, immovable monolith in dark armor, his presence a heavy, protective cloak over the entire courtyard. Flanking them were 50 of Obsidian Ridge's finest warriors, standing in terrifying, absolute silence. The heavy iron gates groaned open. 3 riders entered on horseback. At the center was Thorn, the beta of the Silver Moon Pack. Once, Thorn had been a friend. He had trained alongside Lisa when they were young warriors. Now, he wore the polished, ridiculous silver and white armor David had commissioned, looking incredibly out of place against the brutal, dark backdrop of Obsidian Ridge. Thorn dismounted, his boots splashing in the mud. He looked nervous. He had expected to meet Kale in a dark, bloody dungeon. He hadn't expected the imposing military formation, and he certainly hadn't expected to see Lisa. When his eyes landed on her, Thorn stopped dead in his tracks. Lisa did not look broken. The pallor of the bond sickness was fading. She stood tall, her spine straight, dressed in the dark, pragmatic colors of the enemy. She looked healthy. She looked lethal. And, most shockingly to Thorn, she stood freely beside the Shadow Wolf, not behind him. "Alpha Kale," Thorn began, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence as he cleared his throat. He completely ignored Lisa, addressing Kale directly as per the archaic laws of parley. I speak as the voice of Alpha King David. We demand the immediate return of the Queen of Silver Moon. You are harboring stolen property. Kyle didn't move a muscle. He didn't even blink. He simply let the silence stretch until Thorn shifted uncomfortably under the crushing weight of the Alpha's stare. I harbor no property. Kyle's voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried across the courtyard like rolling thunder. I offer sanctuary to a refugee. If the king has lost his wife, perhaps he should have kept his hands to himself. Thorn flinched at the blunt insult to his king. He finally turned his gaze to Lisa, attempting to project an air of stern disappointment. Lisa, the king is willing to be merciful, Thorn said, his voice taking on a placating, condescending tone. He understands you were emotional. If you return with me now, publicly apologize to Sienna, and submit to a month of isolation to reflect on your actions, he will reinstate your title. Do not make this a war you cannot survive. Lisa felt a cold, bitter laugh bubble up in her throat. Merciful. She looked at Thorn, really looked at him, and saw exactly what the Silver Moon had become. A pack of perfectly polished sycophants serving a narcissistic tyrant. Thorn, Lisa spoke, her voice ringing out clear and cold as a winter morning. Tell your king that my title was Luna, not a dog to be kicked and called back when he needs to maintain appearances. Tell him the bond is broken. The sickness has passed. I am severed. Thorn's eyes widened in genuine horror. A severing was a mythic tragedy, rarely survived, let alone recovered from so quickly. Lisa, you are out of your mind. You are his fated mate. You belong to him. By the authority of the king, I command you to come here. Thorn pushed his meager beta aura outward, attempting to compel her with an order carrying David's delegated authority. It was a fatal mistake. Before the weak wave of compulsion could even brush against Lisa, Kale moved. It wasn't a step. It was a blur of violence. In a fraction of a second, the shadow wolf was off the dais and standing inches from Thorn. Kale released his alpha aura. It didn't push. It crushed. The air pressure in the courtyard plummeted. The horses screamed and reared, tearing their reins from the hands of the other two Silver Moon guards. Thorn was driven to his knees instantly, the breath violently expelled from his lungs as if he had been struck by a falling oak tree. You do not command anything in my territory. Kale snarled, the sound vibrating the pebbles on the ground. His eyes were entirely black, the wolf pushed perilously close to the surface. And you do not speak to her. Thorn gasped for air, his hands clutching the mud, unable to lift his head under the sheer, agonizing weight of Kale's dominance. Kale looked down at the trembling beta, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. Go back to your coward king. Tell him Lisa of Nopak is under the protection of the Obsidian Ridge. Tell him she is an honored guest. And tell him... Kyle leaned in, his lips curling over his teeth. If he or his men take one step across the roaring fork to reclaim her, I will personally mount his head on a spike at the jagged narrows. Kale stepped back, reeling his aura in with terrifying precision. Thorn collapsed onto his hands, coughing violently. Get out of my sight, Kale ordered. Thorn didn't look at Lisa again. He scrambled to his feet, wide-eyed with terror, mounted his spooked horse, and spurred it toward the gates, his guards trailing in chaotic retreat. Lisa watched them go, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had drawn a line in the sand. and Kale had just built a fortress over it. She looked at the Alpha as he walked slowly back up the steps of the dais. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked entirely calm. "Thank you," she whispered as he stopped beside her. Kyle looked down at her, the dark intensity returning to his eyes, softening the harsh lines of his face. "You don't belong to anyone, Lisa," Kyle said softly, for her ears only. "But as long as you are here, you will never be disrespected again." The dawn air was bone-chillingly crisp, the heavy fog clinging to the jagged granite peaks of the Narrows like a tattered gray shroud. Lisa lay flat on her stomach against the freezing damp earth of the northern ridge, peering over the sheer drop into the gorge below. To her immediate right lay Alpha Kale, his massive frame perfectly still, a heavy hunting bow resting easily in his grip. Lining the ridges on either side of the pass were 50 of Obsidian Ridge's most lethal archers, completely camouflaged against the dark stone. Down in the gorge, the path narrowed to a mere 10 feet wide, flanked by vertical cliffs of impassable rock. "They're on time," Kyle murmured, his voice barely carrying over the distant rush of the river. Below them, the mist began to part, sliced open by the gleaming, immaculate white armor of the Silver Moon's elite guard. At the helm of the formation rode General Vance, exactly as Lisa had predicted. But it was the figure riding slightly behind Vance that made Lisa's breath hitch in her throat. David. The Alpha King had come himself. He wore his ceremonial silver breastplate, a ridiculous, ostentatious display of wealth that caught whatever meager sunlight managed to pierce the fog. He looked furious, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. He had clearly dismissed Thorne's warning as a bluff and marched his vanguard straight to the border to exact his vengeance. Lisa felt a cold, clinical detachment wash over her. 5 days ago, seeing him would have triggered a paralyzing wave of submission or a desperate ache of betrayal. Now, looking down at the man who had struck her to appease a manipulator, she saw only a foolish commander marching his men into a slaughter. "He brought the king's guard," Marcus whispered from Kyle's left. 200 men, single file. "Let them get halfway through the choke point," Kyle ordered softly, the command rippling down the line through subtle hand signals. The Silver Moon soldiers marched with arrogant confidence. They didn't look up. They were so accustomed to the superiority of their pristine armor and their king's reputation that they forgot to check the shadows. When the vanguard reached the exact center of the Narrows, Kale stood up. He didn't roar. He simply drew back his bowstring with terrifying power and let an arrow fly. It struck the earth a fraction of an inch in front of General Vance's warhorse. The beast shrieked, rearing back violently. Vance shouted, fighting for control, as the perfect, orderly line of soldiers suddenly crumpled into a chaotic bottleneck. "Archers, draw!" Marcus bellowed. 50 obsidian-tipped arrows were nocked and drawn back, the sound of stretching bowstrings echoing through the gorge like a swarm of angry hornets. Down below, utter panic erupted. The Silver Moon elite looked up, realizing with sudden, horrifying clarity that they were entirely surrounded, trapped in a stone corridor with death aiming down at them from both sides. They drew their swords, a useless gesture against an elevated enemy. "Hold your fire!" Kyle's voice boomed down the canyon walls, infused with just enough alpha resonance to rattle the armor of the men below. David spurred his horse forward, pushing past a struggling General Vance. The Alpha King looked up at the ridge, his eyes burning with golden fury. He opened his mouth to shout a command, a threat, a demand. But the words died in his throat. Lisa stepped up to the edge of the cliff, standing entirely exposed beside Kale. She wore the dark canvas and gray wool of the Obsidian pack. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face pale but resolute. She looked down at David not as a scorned mate, but as a superior tactician looking at a defeated enemy. "Lisa!" David roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Get down here, now! You are outmaneuvered, David." Lisa called back, her voice projecting clearly in the sheer acoustics of the gorge. "Your men are pinned. If Kale gives the order, your entire elite guard will be wiped out before they can even draw their bows." David stared at her, the reality of the situation slowly bleeding through his immense pride. He looked at the steep walls, the trapped men, the archers above. You told him." David spat, realization twisting his features into something ugly. "You gave him our crossing." "I gave him the crossing of an arrogant fool who cares more about keeping his boots clean than protecting his men." Lisa replied coldly. "Stand down, David." Kyle's voice rumbled, heavy with lethal promise. "Turn your men around. If a single Silver Moon soldier takes one more step north, I will turn this gorge into a graveyard. And I will start with your general." David's hands shook on his reins. To retreat was to admit utter defeat. To advance was suicide. He looked at Lisa, expecting to see a flicker of hesitation, a plea for him to save her. But her eyes were like frozen lakes, unreflective and dead to him. With a guttural scream of absolute fury, David yanked his horse around. "Fall back!" he screamed at his men. "Fall back!" Lisa watched them scramble, their perfect white armor smeared with mud as they retreated in humiliating chaos. Beside her, Kale slowly lowered his bow. He didn't cheer. He simply looked at Lisa, profound respect burning in his dark eyes. The great hall of the Obsidian stronghold roared with the sound of clashing tankards and deep, rumbling laughter. The victory at the Jagged Narrows had been bloodless, a testament to strategy over slaughter, and the warriors were celebrating. Lisa sat near the massive hearth, nursing a cup of spiced cider. Every few minutes, a scarred warrior would approach, offering a respectful nod or a murmured word of thanks. Marcus had even brought her a plate of roasted venison, awkwardly addressing her as Lady Tactician. It was overwhelming. For 5 years, David's pack had merely tolerated her, viewing her as an accessory to the king. Here, in the heart of enemy territory, she was being revered for her mind and her courage. She slipped away from the noise, stepping out onto a high stone balcony that overlooked the sprawling, pine-covered valley. The night air was biting, the sky dusted with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. "They like you." Lisa didn't startle at the low voice. She had quickly learned to recognize the subtle shift in the air that signaled Kyle's approach. He stepped onto the balcony, handing her a thick, woven blanket before leaning his forearms against the stone parapet beside her. "They like that they didn't have to bleed today," Lisa corrected gently, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "No," Kyle said, turning his head to look at her. "They respect a leader who values their lives over their egos. They haven't had a Luna's presence in a decade. They recognize the real thing when they see it." Lisa looked down at her hands. "I'm not a Luna anymore, Kale. The bond is gone. A title is given. A nature is born." Kyle murmured softly. He shifted, his broad shoulder brushing against hers. "My uncle had the title of Alpha. He also had a penchant for executing pups who shifted too late, believing them to be weak. I challenged him. I tore his throat out to stop a massacre. The continent calls me the Shadow Wolf, a monster who murdered his own blood. Lisa looked up at him, her heart aching at the quiet sorrow in his dark eyes. The rumors were just that. Rumors built by cowards to explain a bravery they didn't possess. A beast is born of necessity, Lisa whispered, echoing a phrase her mother had taught her long ago. But a monster is born of pride. You are no monster, Kale. Kyle's gaze dropped to her mouth, then back up to her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His large, rough fingers gently grazed the left side of her face. The bruise from David's hand had faded to a pale yellow, but Kyle touched the skin as if it were spun glass. The spark she had felt days ago ignited into a roaring, golden warmth. It didn't burn like the faded bond had. It illuminated. It was a secondary bond, a choice, a true mate bond built not on destiny's cruel decree, but on mutual respect, shared fire, and absolute equality. Lisa leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. "Stay," Kyle whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Not as a refugee, not as a guest. Stay as my equal. Rule this ridge with me." Lisa opened her eyes. She saw no demands in Kyle's face, only an open door. She thought of the cold, gilded cage of the silver moon and the warm, brutal honesty of the Obsidian stronghold. She didn't just want to survive anymore. She wanted to live. "I will," Lisa breathed, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "I'll stay." Kale exhaled a shaky breath, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. In the quiet darkness of the balcony, beneath the vast expanse of the stars, two fractured souls began to seamlessly forge themselves into a single, unbreakable weapon. 6 months later, the Silver Moon Pack was dying a slow, agonizing death. Without Lisa's meticulous management, the pack's resources dwindled. David, increasingly paranoid and volatile, had isolated himself. Sienna, terrified of the very monsters she had helped create, spent her days hiding in the royal wing. Word had spread across the continent like wildfire. Warriors, omegas, and entire families began abandoning the Silver Moon territories in the dead of night. They crossed the Roaring Fork, not as an invading army, but as refugees seeking the legendary sanctuary of the Lady Tactician and the Shadow Wolf. On the summit of the Obsidian Ridge, beneath the light of a swollen, silver full moon, the entire pack had gathered. Lisa stood before them, wearing a breathtaking gown of midnight blue, intricate obsidian beads woven into her dark hair. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely whole. Beside her stood Alpha Kale, radiating a fierce, protective pride that warmed the very air around them. Elder Alara stepped forward, holding a simple crown woven from heavy pine branches and silver thread. There were no elaborate vows of submission. There was no demand for obedience. Kale took Lisa's hand, lacing his fingers perfectly through hers. He looked out at the massive sea of faces, warriors of the ridge, refugees of the moon, all united under one banner. "We are the shadow that protects the weak, and the blade that severs the corrupt." Kale's voice echoed across the mountaintop. He turned to Lisa, his dark eyes shining with absolute devotion. "I claim no ownership over your soul, Lisa. I ask only to stand beside it in the dark, and I claim no throne but the earth we defend." Lisa replied, her voice clear and strong, filled with the resonant power of a true, awakened Luna. "I stand beside you, Alpha Kale, equal in blood, equal in burden." Alara gently placed the crown of pine upon Lisa's head. "I present your Luna!" Alara cried out to the night. A deafening roar erupted from the crowd. Kyle tilted his head back, unleashing a deep, earth-shattering howl that vibrated through the granite of the mountain. Lisa threw her head back and joined him, her voice a beautiful, terrifying harmony to his. Hundreds of wolves shifted and joined the call, a massive chorus of loyalty and triumph that carried on the wind, sweeping down into the valleys and across the roaring Fork River. Miles away, sitting alone in a dark, empty great hall, David heard the howl. He clutched his chest, where a permanent, hollow void now resided. He realized, with crushing, suffocating clarity, that the day he raised his hand to strike his mate was the day he had unmade his own kingdom. He had slapped a Luna, but he had created a queen. Thank you for reading Her Mate Slapped Her for Another Woman. So she left the pack and became the rival alpha's Luna. Lisa's journey from a silenced, abused mate to a powerful, revered tactician and true Luna is a testament to the strength it takes to walk away from toxic situations and reclaim one's own worth. True power is never found in cruelty, but in mutual respect and the courage to demand better for yourself. If you loved this story of redemption, second chance romance, and fierce pack politics, please like, share, and subscribe for more original werewolf dramas, intense romance, and empowering fictional tales. Let us know in the comments what your favorite moment of Lisa's revenge was.